There were a lot of really interesting stories to be told about that, you know, having to deal with the fact that they were finding bodies that had fallen out of the sky everywhere. And what that does to you, I just thought that's a really interesting thing to do, but I couldn't do it. It was just too raw. It was too raw and I couldn't.
How do you write longevity into, or do you look at longevity into a story? So, you know, if you were writing something just before the referendum, for example, would you fit something that is a pivotal historical moment into a book? Does it date it?
It does date it. I mean, it definitely dates it.
Does that matter?
I don't think it matters too much. I mean, my early books could stand as historical documents, you know. No mobile phones, no laptops, very few computers available to the police. Rebus has to stop his car at a telephone box to make a phone call. The fax machine is a new thing. Everybody's excited about getting a fax.
Sounds like Dundee.
Really, I do. But you know, a few years later on, that was all gone. That was all dead in the water, and new technology had come along. So the technology dates very quickly, and it seems like it's dating even quicker now. Yeah. But in some ways, you know, crime's an old story. Crime goes way back to the beginnings of storytelling. I mean, it goes back to myth and legend. It goes back to folk tale and fairy tale. You know, Red Riding Hood is a classic crime story. Just because somebody looks right doesn't mean they are right. There could be a wolf in your granny's clothing, as it were. And there's an awful lot of that, and crime fiction is very much about very basic questions that an audience has always wanted to gnaw on. You know, why do we keep doing bad things to each other? I mean, through history, people have wanted to keep asking that question to try and work out what it is about human beings that makes us so, you know, the possibility for us to be nasty as well as nice. And that's something that we don't need forensics for that or anything else. That's a very basic piece of storytelling. But since I am writing about a professional cop, and the books do exist in something close to real time, that is problematic. That, you know, Rebus is now 65. In fact, he's probably a wee bit older than that, but I've kind of slowed the clock down a bit. So he's had to retire again in the new book that comes out next month. He's gone. He's a consulting detective. So there's only so much I can do with a 65-year-old consulting detective that's realistic, or even semi-realistic.
Do you know, I don't know that's necessarily true anymore, because certainly when you speak to the police forces right up and down the length and breadth of the country, they are retiring very early. They're going out into the world in a different job, and we're losing so much experience from the police forces that they are coming back, and then they keep coming back because that experience eventually people do realise has a value. Yeah.
I think the thing is that the upper echelons of the Scottish police wouldn't want Rebus coming back necessarily. He's not the kind of cop they like. He's the kind of cop who should be getting investigated by internal affairs more than has been his wont in previous books. But no, I mean, so I think that longevity thing, I didn't think about it when I started the books. You know, the first Rebus novel was meant to be the only Rebus novel, and so I didn't think about it at all. And it was only really when it became a series. Well, I mean, two things. One, when it became a series, I thought, and I was making money from it, I thought, oh, well, then I owe it to the professions I'm talking about to actually properly find out what they do. Because my first novel, which I wrote when I was a student, I wrote to I have no idea how the police works. I wrote to the Chief Constable of Lothian and Borders Police.
Did he reply?
Fettes Avenue. His secretary replied, and his secretary said, go to Leith Police Station and talk to these two detectives and they will answer your questions. And I went, great. So I headed off down there, looking like a tramp, and these two very smartly dressed detectives came out to talk to me, and they said, you're writing a book? You know, young tramp man. And because it was like second-hand clothes from Oxfam shops and stuff, and a Doctor Who scarf and all that. And what's your book about? And I gave them the plot of Noughts and Crosses, and not realising that it was almost identical to something that had just happened, and Leith Police Station was the kind of where the inquiry was based. So they managed to haul a computer into an interview room and sat me down at the wrong end of it and said, we'll ask you a few questions. Let's pretend that you're a suspect in an ongoing police. I had no idea. Let's pretend you're a suspect in an ongoing police investigation. Name, date of birth, address, occupation. What are you doing the night of the 5th of October? And I'm going, 5th of October? I've not got a Scooby pal, it's probably out in the lash. You know, you wake up next morning, you can't remember, just give us, you know, an hour and a half. I was answering their questions, and that was it. I was put in the system. I went home that weekend, told my dad, I told my dad that story. He went, you silly bugger.
Yeah.
They thought you did it. Because this was, what was her name? She went missing from a fun fair in Portobello. And then there were 6 more victims after her. And it was a guy called Robert Black. Yeah. But it was that case. But at this time, it was just a missing persons case. And then Noughts and Crosses children are being abducted and killed. And so I'd kind of stumbled into it and I became a suspect. So that's why I didn't go near the police for years after that. Because I didn't want to become a suspect in a police inquiry again. Thank you very much.
Is there a risk when you're writing that it does gel with a community, with a population that is going through something like that of its time? So, you know, we do have, right the way throughout the year, we have key cases that come up, we see them in the courtrooms. Is that something that as a writer you try to avoid, or is it something that you can use?
If it's a type of case that's coming up, I might be thinking, well, what does that say about us? Mm-hmm. What does that say about us as a culture, as a society, as a country, that this kind of thing is happening? And I might then explore that as a possible plot theme for a book. I have occasionally actually used real cases. I mean, I used Bible John in Black and Blue, without thinking, Christ, I might come after me if he's still out there. When I thought that, I thought maybe I shouldn't have written the book. And I used a war crimes suspect, and he was actually living in Edinburgh, an old German who was living in Edinburgh and was suspected of being a war criminal. And then luckily he died before he could sue me. Natural causes. And when they found what was it they found in where the Scottish Parliament is now, which was Queensberry House, which was an old hospital. And when they were sort of rejigging it, they told me the story of the act of cannibalism that took place there centuries ago, where a Duke of Queensberry's nephew had killed a servant and eaten him on the day that Scotland and England joined together. And this was seen as a very bad omen, and the Duke of Queensberry or whatever was chased through the streets. I just thought, great idea, I'm going to put that in a book. So I've done that occasionally, and things like, asylum seekers in Glasgow, when we started getting asylum seekers, and when they were getting, kids were getting locked up, kids of asylum seekers were getting locked up and not getting any proper schooling and stuff. I mean, these have all drip-fed into the books. Because the books are trying to say something about us and who we are, and why does this stuff happen, and how do we feel about that? How do the readers feel about this? But of course, if there's a real case, you can get in trouble. And things like, I thought about Lockerbie for a long time, and because I'd spoken to Professor Anthony Bouzatil, amongst others, and cops who were there, and he was there on the day, other people who were there on the day. There were a lot of really interesting stories to be told about that told us a lot about the people involved, the people who came afterwards, and were having to deal with it in their heads, having to deal with the fact that they were finding bodies that had fallen out of the sky everywhere. And what that does to you, I just thought that's a really interesting thing to do, but I couldn't do it. It was just too raw. It was too raw and I couldn't do it.